Jim Sillars, former deputy leader of the Scottish National Party and once a strong Europhile, made a dramatic U-turn in his views on the EU when his political career came to an end and even claimed Brussels told Scotland to get stuffed during the 2014 independence referendum, an unearthed podcast reveals. Boris Johnson managed to secure a last-minute deal with the European Union this week, but he now has to get it through Parliament, and many opposition parties have rejected the deal. The SNP has even called for another Brexit extension and a general election instead. The SNP was known as an anti-EU party until the 80s. The idea of independence in Europe took away some of the pro-unionist arguments which claimed if Scotland were to leave the UK, it would be isolated. And experts have long since speculated this is a primary reason the SNP changed its stance. In 1988, the new policy of European independence led the SNP to a landslide victory in a Glasgow governed by-election. This was Mr. Sillars' constituency, a former Labour MP who went on to become the SNP's deputy leader during the 90s. His by-election win was the first major disruption for the Labour Party when it was dominating the Scottish Parliament. During his victory speech, he said, "The people of Govan constituency have opened the door of opportunity to the whole of Scotland this evening. The Scottish people will now start marching towards our destiny, which is an independent country, as a member of the European community." However, Mr. Sillars is now a prominent Brexiteer. In a Radio 4 program Brexit, What Happens to Scotland? Broadcast in March 2016 just before the referendum, the former SNP deputy said, "Well, I have another point of view now." He explained, "The EU today is not the EU I argued for independence in Europe in. I have to look at other alternatives. I think the tragedy of the SNP is that since the policy was formed in the late 80s there's really been no examination, or a examination of that policy as treaty after treaty after treaty has built up to Lisbon." In a 2019 Scotsman interview, he revealed that he thought the pro-EU SNP leadership alienated hundreds of thousands of independents supporting Leave voters in Scotland and said he found it impossible to vote in favour of the party during the EU elections. Back in the Radio 4 podcast, he said, in 2014, during the independence referendum, the EU told us to get stuffed. We weren't getting in. If you go for independence then you're out of the EU. And to get back in, you've got a number of hoops you've got to climb in, and at the end it would have to be unanimity, and then there's the Spanish veto. Nothing will change if we stayed in the UK and inside the EU. Why would the EU change its policy, let's say in 2017, from the one it had in 2014? The answer again would be, get stuffed. Scotland expert Sarah Smith asked, so would it be any different if an independent Scotland was trying to get into the EU after a Brexit? Could Scotland just slip into the seat vacated by the UK? An expert witness, who spoke to a Scottish Parliament committee when it considered Scotland's entry to the EU, was also quoted in the podcast. Timing would be key. He explained everyone's nightmare scenario would be the UK leaving the EU, attempting to negotiate its relationship with the bloc, while Scotland simultaneously knocks on the door and tries to break into the Union as an independent state. He said that ideally Britain would sign a piece of paper with the European Union and organise its withdrawal at the same time as Scotland would sign a piece of paper on the terms of its accession. However, he argued it would take longer for Scotland to arrange its entry than for Britain to arrange the terms of its exit. If Parliament votes in favour of Mr. Johnson's deal, the UK will leave the EU on the Brexit deadline, the 31st of October. In comparison, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon only recently announced that she intends to get the ball rolling on calling for yet another independence referendum by calling for a Section 30 order. The expert witness also analysed one particularly tricky term for joining the EU. The Schengen arrangement is a really interesting one because obviously it creates the possibility of borders within the islands. Not only a border between Scotland and England but also potentially a border on the island of Ireland. The 1985 Schengen arrangement was a treaty which essentially abolished the majority of internal borders within the EU. If Scotland were to be in the EU while the rest of the UK was not, its land boundaries could become a contentious issue, just as the divisions between Ireland and Northern Ireland have been over the last few years. However, Mr. Johnson has spent weeks redesigning Theresa May's controversial temporary Northern Irish backstop and agreed to an alternative with the EU. Northern Ireland would still follow some rules of the customs union, without officially being part of it, and there would be customs checks in the Irish Sea instead. Northern Ireland representatives would vote on keeping this arrangement every 4 years. Professor John Curtis discussed what would happen if there was a second independence referendum in Scotland. Many people in Scotland will be faced with what might be a relatively tough choice. Essentially, they are being asked to choose which union matters more to you. Is it the union with the United Kingdom, which Scotland has been part of for over 300 years and has enjoyed the fruits of empire? Or is it the union with the rest of Europe, which is only around 40 years old and which has perhaps been less intense and maybe people feel less worried about? Once that choice has been unraveled, who knows which way people will go?